After trying, and not enjoying Diablo 4 Season 4, I decided to go back to my roots for Season 5. That is to say, play Sorceress. And this time, play all those builds that back in Season 0 weren't very good or weren't quite there. And so of course, the first thing that I wanted to start with was Fireball. Because I remember getting the two uniques for Fireball, Gloves of the Illuminator and Staff of Endless Rage, and thinking, wow, bouncy fireballs, this looks awesome. And then I immediately found out that not only did Fireball suck back then, but the uniques were so bad that it was actually better without them. Now luckily, in Season 5, the opposite is true. The uniques are not only awesome, but Fireball's a great skill. So if you like having bouncy fireballs unleash waves of destruction across the entire screen, maybe wiping out hordes of demons with a simple cast, then this very well could be a build for you. Though in that regard, before I get into everything, I do want to add one quick disclaimer. This build is my season starter. It is by no means min-maxed. I think I've gotten pretty lucky so far. I have decent gear, and of course I based all of this off of Northwar's build over on Maxroll. But I'm sure there's optimizations that can be made. A lot of my affixes aren't perfect. A lot of my gear isn't perfect. If I end up really min-maxing this and make a lot of different choices, then I'll make an update video. But otherwise, I'm probably going to play this for a bit, have my fun, and move on to other things, because even at this level, I'm already annihilating tormented bosses, and I can farm things super quickly and efficiently. So to keep up with any build updates or just see what else I'm playing, do be sure to get subscribed and leave a like while you're down there. For now, let's get into things. This build is absolutely awesome in Helltide. You just press the button once, and an entire wave of monsters simply evaporates. It's also pretty darn good at speeding through Nightmare 100s. Now first when I was playing the build, I found a single target damage to be lackluster. This is because my gearing was terrible, I was missing a lot of crit, to be honest I still am, but also, I was missing one key thing. That is a line on Gloves of the Illuminator that says, +2 mana when a fireball explodes. Because it turns out each bounce counts as an explosion and each projectile counts as a fireball. I had a +1 roll, so I'd throw a bunch of fireballs at a boss, run out of mana, and then my damage would simply turn off. After getting a Gloves of the Illuminator with +2 mana though, I have infinite mana, and now I destroy everything, including tormented bosses. Usually what I'll do is spam a few fireballs until the boss ends up being staggered. Once they're staggered, they pretty much just explode. I do now have a Godslayer crown, but I haven't tested it yet, simply because I got the Godslayer crown while recording the boss kills for this video. Before that, I just hadn't gotten one. I don't know if it's pretty rare, or I was simply unlucky. Goodness knows I got plenty of Gloves of the Illuminator, plenty of Staff of Endless Rage, so the core items that you absolutely need before this build comes online should be relatively easy to obtain. Then things like Godslayer's crown, Ring of Starry Skies, Tal Rasha's, Tyrion's Might or Shaco, all the really nice to haves but not absolutely required, might take a bit more work, or quite a bit more work in the case of the Uber uniques. Now, if I had to say the build had any weaknesses, I'm going to guess it's single target as you get higher and higher into the pit. My gear is far from min-maxed. I only have like 4 tempers on most things, and again, I'm missing a lot of damage and crit. So, I know that my gear can get a lot better and my power can get a lot higher. But so far, the only place that I have noticed myself struggling is on some of those higher pit bosses. 80-ish is super comfortable for me right now, but once I get to 85-ish, that's where the single target starts to lag behind, and as long as I play well, it's still okay. I can build up that stagger, melt the boss in the phase, but if I misplay, I'm probably going to get one-shot. That's because while this build has a lot of really good ways to survive, such as using Frost Nova to freeze enemies solid, teleporting to gain a damage reduction, popping Ice Armor to give yourself unstoppable and a massive barrier, or popping Flame Shield for pure invulnerability, if you don't hit your defensive buttons, you're actually relatively squishy, especially compared to a lot of the other characters like a Barbarian or a Druid. But hey, that's a pretty small price to pay for instantly exploding almost everything on the screen. So now let's get into the skills, Paragon Board, and gearing. Alright, so here we have the skill tree. Now first up is Firebolt. This is both because you need a basic skill and because the enchantment effect is quite nice. This applies a burn that enables all those while the enemy is burning effects, while also doing a little bit of ticking damage. Next up we have Fireball. This is the bouncy explodey Orb of Doom that is absolutely the core of this build. Now because this build does use the Fireball enchantment, it is still massively satisfying to watch your explosion chains wipe out an entire screen. Then for your endpoint, there's either Destructive Fireball, Crit Strike damage bonus when hitting at least 3 enemies, or Greater Fireball, which gives you additional damage based on the burn you inflict. I've gone back and forth between the two, but ultimately I've kind of settled on Greater Fireball, at least for now. Then coming down, Elemental Dominance, good old damage node, For the defensive skills, right now I have all of them clicked, though to be honest at this point, I could easily see myself dropping Frost Nova. If I dropped Frost Nova, I would lose the ability to proc Freeze and also proc Vulnerable, though I have pretty reliable Vulnerable uptime elsewhere. Then, coming down here, Ice Blades. This is a skill to do cold damage. It's pretty low maintenance, and also it's pretty darn effective because it has a chance to make enemies vulnerable. That's why I'm considering dropping Frost Nova entirely from the setup. Of course, align the elements, mana shield, and protection. Very good defensive talents. At minimum, you'll absolutely want protection because you want to have a barrier active at all times. In fact, Icy Veil helps you have a barrier active at all times by increasing barrier duration by 24%. Then down here, of course, Inner Flames. While you're healthy, your barriers keep you healthy. And Devouring Blaze, which is the big old damage multiplier that Sorc has access to that doesn't cause you to take increased damage the way Glass Cannon does. Now, also 1 point in Crippling Flames for a chance to immobilize, though this isn't super important if you have the immobilized temper on your gear. And then coming down here, Fiery Surge just to get into Soulfire. The Pyromancy skills cost less mana is part of why on single target I can just stand still and sustain really easily. But ultimately, even if it's not being doubled, it is pretty darn effective. Now, if I was going to ultimately drop Frost Nova, the thing that I am thinking of doing is investing into an ultimate skill. There's two options. The defensive option, which would be Deep Freeze, and the offensive option, which would be Inferno. But because I have infinite mana anyway, I don't see this as a super efficient point use, and the damage from the Inferno itself is honestly kind of mediocre, which is why I have so far just been sticking to Frost Nova, because that way I can always proc it at the start of a fight, completely disable an elite, or make sure Vulnerable is active before I start hitting them to do other things. Then for the key passive, Esu's Ferocity, since both of those bonuses are going to be active against bosses pretty much all the time. And when you're clearing, I mean, let's be honest, crit strikes that kill enemies, yeah, a crit's going to kill an enemy with how many fireballs are bouncing everywhere. Alright, so Paragon Boards. I'm going to be honest, in terms of Paragon Boards, I was pretty darn lazy. I mostly just net decked from Northwar's Guide, but there's one significant change that I made, which I'm going to talk about in just a moment. First board, Elementalist. This is a really solid glyph, especially if you're constantly doing fire and cold damage and lightning whenever you teleport on top of enemies. Then here, this second board is Searing Heat, and I have Control. This is a little bit different from what Northwar uses. He has Pyromaniac, which gives you a consistent 10% damage multiplier if you're able to cast 5 times within 6 seconds. The reason I don't like this is if I have to run around and dodge stuff, I lose that damage bonus, whereas I can very much count on Control when I time my stagger windows by using a bunch of status effect inflicting tempers. Now, third up, we have the Enchantment Master board, and I'm using Reinforced here. This is a very good damage reduction because I should always have a barrier. For the fourth board, Frigid Fate, dealing bonus damage to vulnerable enemies. And since non-physical damage counts as cold, fire, and lightning, this bonus is pretty darn easy to enable. And in this case, the glyph socketed is Exploit, because who doesn't want vulnerable damage to go with their vulnerable damage? Next up, we have the Burning Instinct board, which doesn't do too much as this really isn't a burning damage build. And Tactician is socketed for, again, increased damage after casting a defensive skill, with the duration increased for each defensive skill not on your action bar. Unfortunately, unless I stop using Frost Nova, every single defensive skill is on my action bar, so I'm just going to be casting all of them constantly. Then Ceaseless Conduit, this is simply a good traversal board, where you put Destruction. Destruction gives a whole bunch of crit strike damage, at least if you can get a good amount of dexterity in there. Then last and also least, another travel board, which is Static Surge, that's mainly just there to enable Flame Feeder. You know, the 10% direct damage to burning enemies, and also a little bit of extra damage to burning enemies, counting the burn effect, because of course, Firebolt enchantment. Alright, so now let's take a look at the gear. First up, my hat, that somehow at 885 item power has continued to survive. Mostly just because this gives a ton of life and it also generally armor caps me, so it's doing everything that I need. I would certainly like a better one, and I did just get a Godslayer's crown, so I'm going to see if I can fix my armor by other means, possibly tempering a different piece. Now swapping to the Godslayers, unfortunately I do lose some life, but hey, if the enemies die faster, maybe I won't need it anyway. Next up, chest piece. This item is also kind of garbage. Int is good, life is good. Defensive skills is technically correct, but it's 2 to 3. It really should be 3 out of 3. And I'm not super happy with the tempers. I could keep trying. It just felt like a bit of a waste on an item that I know I'm going to replace in the near future. Especially if I could get a greater affix for defensive skills rather than intelligence or maximum life. Both of those are super easy to roll and in general super easy to find. Defensive skills a lot more rare. It'll typically only roll one of the defensive skills. But as this build collects them all, just like Pokemon, it is really best to have lower levels in all of them than higher levels in one of them. If you happen to have higher levels in one of them, I would go for teleport, just because teleporting around constantly is fun. Then, Gloves of the Illuminator. The most important thing is again the +2 mana when Fireball explodes. Otherwise, you are going to mana starve on single target. But beyond that, having something like the Fireball does less damage when it bounces, you want that to be as low as possible, so this 5% is really good. Then Fireball attack speed, crit chance, Fireball level. Those are all cool and nice and fun. They're definitely not required. And also, for greater affixes when masterworking, you probably don't want the mana affix to get the greater affix increase. This is because at 2, I'm already fully sustaining mana, so I'm hoping it hits other things, which so far it has. Third up, Pants. These give me intelligence, life, and armor. I need life and armor, and intelligence is damage. Though I have no complaints about these. I managed to roll both warmth and a chance to slow enemies. The chance to slow really is just you want to slow, stun, daze, anything, freeze. All of those things are really nice. Immobilize, get all the CCs on enemies so you can prevent enemies from hitting you, or build up that stagger on bosses. Then we have these boots. These are really cool. Int, max life move speed, I love them. Personally, I'm a move speed enjoyer. I don't really like evading around. I like just running around. With a lucky hit, again, chance to freeze, get as many of those CC effects as possible to perma-stagger bosses. And double move speed, thanks to the temper. Ideally, this would actually be greater affix on the move speed instead of the int or the life, but hey, these are already really good, and you can expect to see these in future builds as well. Now, the Staff of Endless Rage is one of the centerpieces of the build. You have your fun bouncy fireballs. Now, every third cast, it deals a lot more damage. You get extra projectiles. You get a ton of extra fireball levels. You get fireballs to cast twice. It's pretty darn good. And 100% chance to cast twice means I fill the screen with even more bouncy fireballs. So this item is a very big win. Eventually, I'll probably want one that has greater affix on the fireball or fireball chance to cast twice. At least assuming the over 100% actually does anything. Then for my amulet, this is Random Floor Trash. It was one of the first 925 items that I got off of a world boss. But hey, it has cooldown reduction, and so it's been really hard to replace. But ideally, I should get something that has Devouring Blaze or some sort of other skill level that massively boosts my damage. I'm just still a little hesitant to give up the CDR because it feels really good and I haven't been super lucky in rolling a better amulet yet. Then for a ring, also, not super great, but this is the first thing where I hit the lucky hit, chance to make enemies vulnerable. This is another way to ensure that enemies are vulnerable as much of the time as possible. So I'm going to look to replace this as soon as another ring that honestly might not even have life on it. It might just be something like crit attack speed, lucky hit. Basically, as soon as I get another ring that rolls the lucky hit, I'm probably going to replace this. And last, but definitely not least in this case, is Talrasha's Iridescent Loop. This provides a damage bonus, which you can maintain by using Fire, Cold, and Lightning. So in the case of this build, fire is pretty obvious. You're doing fire with everything. Lightning comes from teleporting on top of an enemy to damage them, and Frostblades gives you that nice cold proc, and also it's higher vulnerable uptime. So you get a lot of extra cooldown reduction and extra damage from using Talrasha's Iridescent Loop. Now, with all that said, this build is not fully optimized. This is just the gear I had and the choices that I've made so far. If you want to see an optimized version of a build, check out Northwar's guide over at Maxwell GG. But even not being optimized, and even when I had just a sacred version of Staff of Endless Rage and Gloves of the Illuminator, this felt absolutely awesome to play. So, what am I going to do differently? What am I going to change? All that fun stuff. First up, I need to get a better helmet, specifically one that's 925 and ideally one that has cooldown reduction on it. Second of all, I want a better chest piece, specifically one that has a higher level of defensive skill. And third of all, I really need to replace my amulet because as nice as the cooldown reduction is, and as much as I want whatever future amulet I have to have cooldown reduction, not having something like Devouring Blaze or any of the other multiplicative damage increases is an absolutely massive DPS loss that's going to hold me back as I continue pushing the pit. Though before I make too many decisions on that helmet, I am going to try out some Godslayer Crown, because yoinking enemies in does seem to be pretty fun. And hey, if I'm feeling too squishy, maybe I will ultimately drop Frost Nova for Deep Freeze, as having yet another invulnerability button definitely can't hurt. Or more accurately, it can't hurt me, it can absolutely hurt the enemies. But I also don't know how much I'm going to min-max this character, because Chain Lightning also looks super awesome, and I haven't played Frozen Orb, but I have heard it's really good. So I'm going to be trying both of those builds sometime soon, and maybe I'm going to be playing those instead of min-maxing my current character, as I think I have all of the necessary legendary aspects and unique items. With that said, if you're looking for a character that's super fast, very fun, and doesn't require too many items, I can absolutely recommend Fireball Sorc as a starter. It's the thing that got me through my season start, took me all the way to 100, and kept me interested in playing Diablo 4. So if you are going to start it and you have to level a character from scratch, you don't have any of the gear, I recommend leveling as Firewall. That transitions very nicely. Basically, you play Firewall until you get your gloves and your staff. After that, you play Fireball and you watch the entire screen explode. And trust me, there's nothing more satisfying than going into an Infernal Horde, seeing an absolute screen packed with demons, and watching your Fireball explosions rip through all of them within under a second. And speaking of, I don't know if you saw in the recording earlier, but a world boss is about to spawn, so I should probably go take care of that. I'll just leave you with a question. Do you think uniques are better or worse in Season 5? On the one hand, they feel a lot more powerful, so it kind of feels like an obligation to include them, but on the other hand, they feel awesome to use, so I don't necessarily mind that obligation. Personally, I'm leaning towards uniques feel really good, and I'm glad they got buffed. But I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts down in the comments below. And of course, before I go, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to support is down below. And a big thanks to everyone who watched the video to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed seeing some of my thoughts on my season starter. I've been playing D4 a little bit more casually this season, though I guess since I'm level 100, maybe not super casually. But either way, didn't do that on day 1, took a little bit. And as a result, I've been enjoying it at least a lot more than I did last season when I tried to take it a lot more seriously. So who knows, maybe for me, D4 is just a casual game to be played casually. So as I continue playing, look forward to some more videos on some more builds, maybe my thoughts on the Infernal Hordes or how to min-max them if I find any tricks, and I might even do a video on Indariel and her mechanics, since I kind of did one for all the other bosses and it'd be weird if I left her out. So, with all that said, thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you on those videos.